What is up, guys? It's your boy, Deposit Those Medallions, Cacus, and today, Bungie just dropped a brand new article called Season 21 Abilities Tuning Preview, going over the buffs and the nerfs they're making to, mainly supers actually, within the upcoming Season of the Deep, arriving very soon. And so, let's get started. So, first of all, here are the high-level goals for these changes. Firstly, they want to increase the viability of roaming supers in high difficulty PvE content. Next up, they want to incorporate subclass keywords into a selection of light subclass supers. Then they want to reduce the amount of unlimited uptime mobility available in the Crucible, and they want to increase build crafting capabilities of a selection of Stasis and light subclass aspects. So, let's get started here with some pretty big changes to the amount of fragments that can go into different aspects. Because again, this opens up a lot of build crafting possibilities. So here are the following aspects that are going to have their fragment slot capabilities increased from 1 to 2. So for Hunter, Trapper's Ambush, Shatter Dive, and Gunpowder Gamble. So all those just got a lot better. For the Titan, Bastion, and Juggernaut. Honestly, I can't believe Bastion is in here. It is insanely powerful, so huge power surge for the Void Titans. And for Warlock, Chaos Accelerant, which is pretty sweet as well. Now, moving on from there, we have super tuning updates. So, first of all supers have increased their PvE damage resistance by 20%. So you are harder to kill in PvE in every single super. Moving on from there, specifically for the Hunter, a Golden Gun, both Marksman and Deadshot, they've increased the PvE damage by 20%. Now for Arc Staff, they've increased the PvE damage again by 20%. Now specifically, Golden Gun is already used in some like cheesy raid boss killing strategies, so the fact that that's getting a damage increase is pretty insane. Moving on from there, Spectral Blades specifically, they're going to increase the PvE damage by 35%, and Heavy Attack now weakens targets on hit, so that's going to debuff them. They're going to take, I think, 15 to 30% more damage, and also they fixed an issue causing some right-hand Spectral Blades attacks to fail to connect when attacking at maximum attack speed. So way more damage combined with the fact that it weakens, which is even more than the 35% more damage, right? And it's way more consistent. Spectral Blades might finally be worth using. Moving on from there, we have Gathering Storm. So direct impact damage versus players increased from 200 to 300. Delaying lightning strike damage versus players increased from 300 to 500. Lingering lightning tick damage versus players increased from 40 to 60. And it now deals increased damage versus Well of Radiance and Ward of Dawn. So now it's more of a counter to those two supers. But moving on from there, we have the Titan. So first of all, for Fists of Havoc, the light attack cost reduced from 8.5% down to 6%. The heavy attack cost reduced from 18% down to 12%. They increased the heavy attack PvE damage by 33%, and heavy attack now blinds targets near the center of the slam arena, which can potentially be very good if you're blinding, big yellow bar enemies where now they're not able to smack you back. That could be very good. However, a lot of the bigger enemies in the game, mini bosses are immune to being blinded, so we'll have to see how that plays out. Moving on from there, for Glacial Quake, they've increased the Shiver Strike thrust speed while in super by 10%, and they've increased light attack damage by 20%. Moving on from there, for Sentinel Shield, they've increased the PvE damage by 20%. For Hammer of Soul, they've increased the PvE damage by 10%. And for Burning Maul, they've increased the PvE damage by 10%. And it now creates a sunspot on cast when Soul Invictus is equipped, matching the behavior of Hammer of Soul. And the Heavy Attack Cyclone now applies Scorch over time. That's actually kind of huge, because you get that 10% damage increase, that's one thing. But now if you're causing Scorch, and remember you can now put on fragments that improve the Scorch damage, and if you apply enough Scorch, which if you're spinning around, I'm sure you will, you're going to cause ignites, and you could even put on more fragments to improve that ignition effect. You're potentially doing way more damage with Burning Maul after this update. However, it is time to move on from there to the Warlock. So, for Nova Warp, they've increased PvE damage by 15%, and a fully charged attack now makes enemies volatile on hit, which is pretty huge. And for Nova Bomb, they've increased PvE damage by 20%. Nova Bomb is already pretty cracked, especially if you really invest into getting your super back fast. You can spam that thing quite often. This is a very big deal in my opinion. Now, moving on from there, for Arc, for Storm Trance, they've increased PvE damage by 25%. Damage ramp while attacking now occurs more quickly, over 3 seconds, down from having to be 5 seconds to ramp up. And the landfall, detonation, and seekers now jolt targets. Jolt is one of the better effects in the game for ad clearing and single target damage, so that is a big deal. Moving on from there, Chaos Reach. Used to be meta. Ever since the Geomegs got nerfed, however, it's not, so let's see here. They've increased the PvE damage by 25%. Sustained damage on a single target now creates a jolting lightning strike at the target's location. Increased damage resistance versus players from 40% to 50%. They've increased the maximum strafe speed from 3.5 meters per second to 4.5 meters per second. And they've adjusted the super camera to avoid the player's body blocking the view of targets when strafing. So overall, 25%, and now that jolt effect, yeah, that could actually be a serious damage dealer. Moving on from there, for Winter's Wrath, they've increased the PvE damage by 10%, and then they say finally for Daybreak, they've adjusted super camera to allow the player to look further down to avoid VFX blocking the view of targets when moving quickly. Moving on from there, guys, specifically for some Strand tuning updates for the Hunter, Threaded Spike, the melee. They've increased the projectile travel range before returning to the player by 30%. They've increased damage versus PvE combatants by 55%. Huge. They've slightly reduced the speed of the dart as it returns to make it easier to catch. They've increased the energy gain for catching a dart based on the number of enemies hit. It now pierces Cabal Phalanx shields, and it no longer prioritizes the catch action over the grapple melee if an enemy target is within grapple range. Moving on from there, for the Titan Frenzied Blade, they've decreased the cooldown based on how many melee charges the player has stored. So at 0 charges, the cooldown is reduced by 15%. At 2 charges, the cooldown is reduced by 30%. Moving on from there, for the Warlock, the Arcane Needle, they've decreased the cooldown based on how many melee charges the player has stored. So at 0 charges, cooldown reduced by 15%. At 2 charges, 30%. They've increased projectile speed based on the flight time, so the initial velocity increased to 40 meters per second up from 30, and the final velocity is 70 up from 60. And they've increased projectile tracking strength by about 10%. Now for the grapple, they reduced the base cooldown from 105 seconds down to 82 seconds, which is pretty significant, and they've reduced the minimum time between grapple activations from 2.5 seconds down to 0.2 seconds. And then for Thread of Generation, they've reduced the energy generation provided by some damage over time mechanics, and they've reduced the energy generated provided by trace rifles specifically by 36%. Now moving on from there, we have some Stasis tuning updates. So, for the Hunter, Withering Blade, they increased the projectile tracking search range on bounce versus players by 20%, and they've increased the maximum tracking strength by 12.5%. Now for the Titan, the Shiver Strike, the maximum thrust while in flight increased by 16%. They decreased the maximum downward influence of gravity while in flight by 18%. And for Howl of the Storm, increased the width of the freezing cone versus players by 31%. And for the Warlock, Frost Pulse now provides 2 meters of additional melee lunge range after activation for 1.2 seconds. But moving on from there, guys, still more changes, this time in the light subclass tuning updates section. First of all, for the Titan, Seismic Strike, Shield Bash, and Hammer Strike now cost 15% of your melee energy on activation. So Bungie is doing this so you can't spam these movement abilities over and over again in PvP. I still do that in PvE, so it's going to affect me. However, the base cooldowns are now standardized at 91 seconds. So previously ranged from 101 to 114. So all 3 of them will recharge faster. However, again, you're not going to be able to spam these movement abilities as much as before. Moving on from there, guys, for Knockout, the lunge range reduced from 6.5 meters to 5.5. The uncharged melee PvE damage bonus increased from 60% to 100%, huge. Moving on from there, for Shield Throw, they increased the base impact damage from 60 to 70, and they increased the consistency of finding and adjusting initial trajectory towards a new target after a bounce. And for Throwing Hammer, now adjusts its initial flight trajectory based on your aim assist target. Moving on from there, for Soul Invictus, they've increased the damage dealt by sunspots to enemy players per tick from 17 to 22. Moving on from there, guys, for Hunters. So for Snare Bomb, they've increased the PvE weakened duration on detonation from 4 seconds to 8 seconds. That's actually pretty huge. Then for Proximity Explosive Knife, the detonation damage versus players reduced from 105 down to 90, and the impact damage versus players increased from 14 to 20. So you're actually going to have to be accurate with those. Then for the weighted throwing knife, so they say on mouse and keyboard, they reduced the minimum tracking shape size by 25% and maximum tracking shape size by 10%. This shape grows over 0.5 seconds after the projectile is thrown. Then for lightweight knife, projectile speed increased from 30 meters per second to 40, and the tracking shape size increased by 20%. Then also for Gunpowder Gamble, they reduced the cooldown from 12 seconds to 6 seconds, and it gets that extra fragment slot. Remember, that's a pretty big increase. And then lastly, guys, for the Warlock. So for Incinerator Snap, they fixed an issue preventing the secondary projectile arming shape from activating. The total damage versus players reduced from 150 to 135 to compensate for dramatically increased consistency. Then with Ball Lightning, they've increased PvE damage by 30%, and they've reduced the ping scaler on both primary and secondary detonations, so combatants are less likely to be knocked out of the secondary strike area while the player is amplified. Then with Chaos Accelerant, guys, for Scatter Grenade, they've increased the tracking and consistency of the charged Scatter Grenade submunitions. They've increased the submunition arming duration, and they fixed a bug where some submunitions were impacting the ground on creation in some situations, resulting in early detonations. And so for the Magnetic Grenade for handheld Supernova, increased the charge hold time from 3.2 seconds to 4.5 seconds. Moving on from there, for Lightning Surge, they fixed an issue allowing Lightning Surge to deal more instances of secondary strike damage than intended. Now targets can take a maximum of 2 instances of damage from a single activation of the ability, one from the primary lightning strike around the player and one from the secondary lightning strike. This change necessitated some changes in damage values, but in general, its damage output should be significantly more consistent and slightly higher than the intended value previously, but without the ability to one-shot a single enemy guardian from full health. And then, guys, lastly, I promise we have the subclass keyword tuning updates. So for Scorch, increase stun time before stacks begin falling off from 1.5 seconds to 2.3 seconds on players, so you're going to burn for longer. increase stun time before stacks begin falling off from 3 seconds to 4.5 seconds on PvE combatants. Then moving on from there with Jolt, they've reduced the PvE damage by 15%, unfortunate, and they've reduced the additional damage scalar versus major combatants by 20%, unfortunate. Then we've got the Speed Booster. So the bonus jump acceleration scalar reduced from 1.5 times to 1.25 times now activates while sprinting after 2.5 seconds, down from 3 seconds, now lingers while the player is not sprinting for 2 seconds, up from 1.5 seconds, fixed a bug where if the player was already sprinting and then became amplified, the speed booster would not be granted, so it should be more consistent. Whew! Absolutely massive changes today here, guys, and certainly a lot of supers just got some huge increases in power, specifically the roaming supers. Like, these are some big numbers in terms of PvE damage increase, but also we get more fragments and like the addition of certain keywords, and they've just been really improved. So 100% in Season 21, I know I'm going to be trying a lot of these things out and making builds with them and so on. So make sure you're subscribed so you get those build videos as soon as they come out. Guys, that is it for the video. Hope you enjoyed and found this informative. If you did, please remember to help me out by simply rating and especially sharing this video. If you want to see more Destiny 2 content similar to this, don't be afraid to slap that subscribe button. If you want to get in touch with me and keep up to date with the latest channel activity, the best way is to follow me on Twitter at RickCacus. That is linked in the description down below. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good day.